When we start delving deep into this biblical model of missions that we see Paul carrying out in Acts and his epistles, we start finding riches that are there for everyone to see, but most people don't see them. And I believe that this particular topic, how Paul approached finances in ministry, of everything related to what he was doing, is both richer than most people ever imagined, because they haven't pulled together multiple places where we're told something about Paul's approach. And I believe it is also one of the most important issues that we can learn from Paul. I've talked to people or heard from people who talked about one aspect of this approach and sort of assumed or even referenced that they were Pauline in their approach, but they're not actually seeing the whole thing. And when it's all together is when it becomes so powerful. So for me personally, years ago, when I began to more deeply research Paul's mission strategy, I think this is the area that I benefited from the very most in my personal application, and also just counseling missionaries and also counseling local pastors and churches in the places where we live. So I think this is one of the really core key pieces of this whole study about mission strategy. And we see it not being followed and having disastrous impacts in so many places. And so I hope that you'll jump in with me here and look carefully at how did Paul deal with money in every aspect of his ministry. Well, let's begin with just a little bit of mission background, and I'm going to introduce this phrase, indigeneity. Now, that's a word that comes from botany, and it really references the type of plant that is native to an area, that's used to the climate and the soil conditions, like we have here in California. There's certain plants that thrive, but most people have yards and gardens filled with plants from somewhere else that need constant attention and honestly need resources from outside all the time, or they just won't make it. So that's the concept here of indigeneity. Early Protestant missionaries, the Moravians, William Carey, Adoniram Judson, for instance, did not subsidize local churches or workers in the places where they went to do missions. This is especially true, let's say, in the 1700s and up into the early part of the 1800s. And for the Moravians, it's because they just decided church was so complicated that they only did evangelism. And for Carey and Judson, who were definitely church planting, being Baptists, it didn't make sense to them at all that you would support a church which should be standing on its own feet, like hopefully every Baptist church does. But in the mid-1800s especially, subsidy became a common method of Western missionaries. A lot of these were European missionaries who were coming from state churches, for instance, and they viewed the churches they're planting in Africa or in Asia, wherever they were, as an extension of that denomination, that state church back home. And pastors back home get paid by the government, so why wouldn't they be out here as well? And so that led to a whole new approach and way of thinking, and it became probably in most areas the dominant form of missions by the 1850s and probably for much of the next 100 years. Rufus Anderson and Henry Venn are two who, again, in the mid-1800s, noticed that these churches that had outside funding were not reproducing. And that is exactly what we see even today. So they began to champion an indigenous church, and they came up with this 3-self formula, as it was referred to, of self-supporting, self-governing, and self-propagating. And if the church is subsidized in any way, then 99% of the time it's not going to become this, and it's not going to reproduce. So after a little bit after that, maybe about 3 decades later, after Anderson had written about this, a missionary in China named John Nevius, who was a friend of Southern Baptist missionaries, for instance, and really a wonderful missionary from what we can see, compared the two systems that he saw in China. There was the strong mission subsidy approach, which the missionary might come in, build a building, maybe start a school, probably have a little clinic a couple of days a week, have the mission houses right there, and they're probably on a compound. And the assumption was that this whole mission moneyed approach was going to produce churches out of it, versus what he saw where just local people got a hold of the gospel, and it got a hold of them, and they're transformed, and they begin to get together and study together, and quickly somebody among the group rises up to become the leader. And so they're never dependent on outside funding or even long-term leadership from outsiders. And he showed that the indigenous approach, it might actually be a little bit slower at first, but it very quickly begins to multiply, and the other one simply can't unless you get more foreign resources from outside. Then, in 1912, Roland Allen, who we talked about in this class, does the same thing essentially for China. He sees this 2 different approaches in China, and he asks, should we follow the Paul method, which is indigenous and isn't subsidized from outside? God has blessed that church, and those people in their own way should support that church, provide their own place to meet, all those kinds of things on their own, versus this very traditional church mission from outside expertise, outside funding, outside building, maybe everything is from outside. And Allen says the same thing, that the indigenous approach can multiply, and it can keep winning more and more people, whereas the other traditional, very strongly subsidized mission, even on the basis that we think it might lead to a stronger church, almost never does, and it just changes the DNA of that whole church community. And generally, they just don't go out and win their people to Christ. Well, what I find today is that many practitioners, both overseas as well as people who are deeply involved in missions on this side of the water, back home, don't seem to have any knowledge of this principle or the lessons learned from this regarding subsidizing local churches. And so going, for instance, church to church missions is what I hear a lot of people say, where this wealthy church in America is sending money to a church in a much poorer country. In most cases, all they're doing is causing dependency, but it doesn't seem that a lot of people today have any knowledge of this or awareness or certainly any concern about this approach. So as we look at Paul, we go to Acts 18, we see that Paul is working with his hands. And we know that Palestinian rabbis in the first century usually were not paid fully. They might have gotten a little help, but basically they had a trade skill that fed their family, and Paul certainly did. So we know that culturally strong, calloused hands was a Jewish ideal. They were hardworking people. They were blue-collar people. They were largely farmers or tradesmen. And Paul, of course, was a tradesman, and he used his hands. His hands were probably strong and calloused, and we see Paul depended on this for his own support. Now, we often refer to Paul as a tent maker, and that's a possibility. The word is a little obscure, but some of the sources that I've read make a lot of sense by saying that this probably is reference to a larger use of leather, and that they are a leather worker. That way, a tent maker, the problem with being a tent maker is that you would have to have a huge amount of leather to start producing many tents. Whereas just a leather worker who might be making sandals and bags, a saddle, or multiple things, belts, out of leather, could take a small amount of leather, set up shop, and very quickly be producing things with his hands. I think Paul was probably a leather worker. And based on what we know of the culture at that time, he either learned this from his own father, but he wasn't home much during the years he would have been learning this, it seems, or he would have been apprenticed to a man with this trade who was a good teacher. And so that's probably where Paul learned it by watching and helping, and someone helping him develop the skills that are better and better skills to be doing this completely on his own. Now, one of the things about leatherworking that some commentators point out is that it's one of the easiest things to go set up somewhere. It's immensely portable. We think in our day of somebody with a computer can do all kinds of work wherever they are. You can set up and you can sit out in the park and do it, or in a coffee shop, or at home, or wherever. A leatherworking toolkit was probably about the size of a small computer bag or so. You needed a knife to cut. You needed an awl. Not a huge number of tools. You had to be good with them, but this wasn't some big, huge box or pack that you would have to cart from town to town. And remember how many times Paul is running from one city to get to the next. Then he gets to that next city, and from what we can tell, he seems to have set up, his trade there very quickly, and is bringing in money to eat and find lodging with. So leatherworking was probably a really great portable profession during Paul's day. And there's this other advantage to leatherworking. Many of the trades in the market in major Greek cities were either loud or unusually smelly. There may be usually some kind of chemicals or caustic something, and just they either just really smell bad, or they were loud, using loud tools. Almost everything about leatherworking is sort of quiet. And because you're sitting there working on a bench, and probably you buy the bench or have one made for you when you arrive in the city, this is a great trade to have as you are sharing the gospel or discipling someone at the same time. Most trades would have been more difficult. Paul's trade was portable, and it was practical for doing ministry as you're making your living. That's not true of all trades, even today. So this is actually really interesting that this is a part of Paul's whole life. So Paul is a hardworking person himself, and he talks about that a lot. And he's not expecting He's not waiting on someone to send him support. He has found a way to go about his mission. And if he gets support from outside, great. He's happy to have that. But he's not dependent on anybody. This is a do whatever it takes approach to going about his mission. So, as a leather worker or tent maker, he supported himself and his colleagues, Acts tells us. So Paul must have been pretty good at this, and maybe some of the younger members of his team who joined him were not as skilled, perhaps, as Paul was. So he's actually working to feed himself and some of the members of the team. He talks about being a witness in the market, which is where he would have set up his trade. And markets were, the center of life and conversation, and certainly the economy of every city. It wasn't just a place where people did business. It's where they came and talked politics and religion and everything else. So this was an extremely natural place to be, so that you could talk to people about Jesus and what he's done for mankind. And so Paul's there, let's say, sitting on a bench, making leather goods and free to talk and listen and disciple people as he's working. Paul was very concerned, and he states this multiple times, that he wanted to avoid accusations of preaching for profit. We know culturally that at this time Greek lecturers or teachers either made people pay a fee to come to their lecture, or more likely in the bigger cities perhaps, they worked for a patron. They had some wealthy person who had heard them speak and thought that they were really good, but then the patron begins to influence what they're saying, because the patron has some kind of agenda. So Paul knows that some of the best known lecturers and speakers in his day went from place to place, and you were never really sure whether they were speaking their own convictions or how much of their speech was to please that patron, that wealthy man or woman who's basically paying them a salary. And I think in this cultural context, we see why Paul repeatedly talks about the fact that the people that he was speaking to did not pay him. He didn't take money from them, because this changes. He wants people to know, I am doing this out of conviction and out of concern for the people that I'm speaking to. And Paul is doing something that seems to be quite intentional, the way that he talks about it. And again, there are multiple references to all these things. It's not just once. These things pop up regularly in his writings. He is intentionally modeling self-reliance as a lifestyle. Paul believes that every man ought to be feeding himself and his own family. And so he doesn't want to be a beggar coming into these places, because when these people gather together, he doesn't want anybody coming to Christ thinking, I'm going to get in this group and then I'm going to get fed by somebody else too. No, the whole point of Paul's ministry of being a tent maker, leather worker, is he wants these people to know that they have to be hardworking people. In fact, he says it's a part of the Christian life. And we can also see repeatedly, Paul's ministry would have been much more difficult if he didn't have this mobility of, having to run from this city overnight and taking this small bag of tools perhaps with him so that he can set up shop in the very next city. If it was, a big enterprise, every time he had to shut down in a city, it could have ruined him financially. But his particular trade, his own way of making money for himself and to support his team, was incredibly flexible and very, very mobile.